which they discussed at the G7 failed to change President Biden's mind. This was absolutely on the cards. No one was going to know exactly when it was going to happen. But the Taliban, be quite clear, have conducted a model campaign that has stayed inside what we call our decision cycle from the moment they started getting into Kandahar. And we've been caught napping. And that's what we should now focus on. Why did that happen? I'm sure it's something to do with command and control in London rather than necessarily anywhere else. And
Bob Seeley, just briefly before we go, a question to the future. We've seen Dominic Raab now aligning himself with the Biden worldview. This man, this foreign secretary, who is championing global Britain, but has to now, I guess, adopt a kind of isolationist approach in as much as there won't be any of these interventions again.
Well, we don't know that because you never know what's in the future. Dominic Raab was sympathetic towards Biden's isolationism. That is true. For me, the big question is, what is the difference between an enduring operation, South Korea, Cyprus, and all these other examples, which use up a lot of troops, and so-called forever wars? Because a lot of this is about political perception in countries. And if we are serious, if the UK and the West is serious about defending our values, our way of life, and our interests, we have got to understand better what enduring interests look like rather than just walk away because we think it's politically popular.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for joining us this evening. And so to Kabul, which with eerie efficiency has seen the Taliban get down to the job of running the country on their second day in control. And for all those holding their breath or not to see whether this time would be very different, the answer came quickly. Today, the deputy head of the Taliban's political office was asked whether women would be allowed to work with them.
Maybe they will be in the government in the lower these things, because in every department of the government ministries, you can say almost half of the workers are women. So they can come back to their work and they can continue. But maybe in this new government which has been announced, in the top post, I mean to say in the cabinet, they may not be women.
What does it feel like to hear those words if you've been a minister in that country's government, if you've served your country, fought for those changes, only to find yourself now exiled from it? Well, we're joined by Nargis Nehan, who was herself a minister in the Afghan government and was last week evacuated from Kabul to Norway. I just want your thoughts, really, Nargis. I'm imagining it is uncomfortable listening to have that spelt out. You would never do your job again under this regime.
It's very uncomfortable because all of us work very hard for women's meaningful participation in the policies and decision-making of the country in the last 20 years. And suddenly being and representing 50% of the population, you're hearing that you'll not be in the decision-making role anymore. It's very much devastating and disappointing. The problem is that the definition of inclusive government has become very limited now. People are thinking that by having few token representatives, men from different ethnicities, they can call the government representatives and inclusive. Or actually, the definition of inclusive government is that you need to have true representatives of different representatives from different genders, ethnicities, and different ideologies of the society, so that every group of the society can see themselves being part of that. You cannot call a government inclusive if people do not see themselves in that. So I don't think this government is going to be inclusive. I don't think they will be able to have support of the people. And they are dealing with a different Afghanistan that soon or later they're going to realize that.
But well, what do you mean by that? Because it sounds like you're saying that there will be a fight back, whether it's from the young women that are watching this and saying no, or from any of the minority communities you've spoken about, whether it's young gay men, lesbian women, people that now feel that they are excluded from being any part of the future country. What are you expecting them to do?
I mean, we have seen that previously as well, that a previous government also tried to have token representative from other ethnicities, from other groups, and calling it always representative. But they could never were able to connect to people and be the representative of people. And that's why they could not have, end of the day, support of the people, even within the national security forces. So I was hoping that Taliban would learn from that lesson and would not repeat itself. The problem is that they're repeating it, and repeating means that they're not going to have public support. And besides not having public support, there are going to be resistance and uprisings against them, because people are much more aware now. They have different aspiration for Afghanistan, and they have different expectation from the government now.
But they're a militant organisation. They're a combat organisation. I mean, we've seen what happens when you try and rise up against the Taliban. You get killed.
Absolutely. I mean, in the last few years, uprising, especially by having demonstration, has been very difficult because of security restrictions in Afghanistan. But the social media has provided a very strong tool for Afghan people. And if you see, people have, most of the time, they have collectively raised their voice very strongly using the platform of social media for their issues and causes. And I'm sure they'll continue to do that, and they'll try to seek different means to raise their voice. And people are now connected in the social media, so they're going to use that.
And yet, Nags Nahan, you are, for the second time in your life, an Afghan refugee, having to now live out your life in exile in Norway. I wonder what message you would give to countries like ours, to local communities all over the world who are wondering whether and how they should open their arms to Afghan refugees.
One is that they need to open their arms to Afghans, because I was just listening to the news before starting my interview, and we saw how irresponsible this whole withdrawal happened. And Afghan people on the ground ultimately paid the price of this irresponsible withdrawal, and they're still paying the price of that with our lives and with our country and with all the achievements that we have had and in the last 20 years, of course, with the support of the international community. So we hope that people do not forget that, and they continue their support, especially humanitarian support to Afghanistan.
Okay.
It's also important for the countries to have true and honest discussions among themselves. The decision that is led and made by the United States was one of the very historically irresponsible decision. And I think countries, especially the European, UK, need to have a meeting among themselves and need to hold the US accountable for making such an irresponsible decision, which we saw the consequence of that, basically not only fall of Taliban, but fall of the international intervention of the whole world.
Okay, thank you very much, Narges Nahan, thank you. So how should councils around Britain respond to the call to take in Afghan refugees? It's a live question now. Around 15,000 have been evacuated to safety in the past couple of weeks, but what happens to them in the longer term is less clear. The government believes around 100 councils in England, just a third, have come forward to take them in. So should they be housed more evenly around the country, or will that risk a clash with council chiefs who say they simply can't afford to put the newcomers first? Here's Seema Kotecha.
A new life in a new country, but all tinged with a deep sadness, leaving their homeland to escape the Taliban.
It's heartbreaking when I see back home, feeling very bad for my country, for my people. Innocent people are being died now. Two of my friends were about to come in the bomb blast here, but
Javid was one of the first Afghans to arrive in the West Midlands from Afghanistan since the Taliban took over. He came as part of the Afghan relocation scheme, set up to help those who worked for the British forces settle here in the UK.
the problem started from my province where I live, where I'm from. You know, it started from the same place. Many times some of the districts were captured by Taliban, and then it just gone day by day. And in the meantime, like when I was here, I heard that it was just gone. I mean, every province was handed over.
He's one of thousands of Afghans given refuge here as part of Operation Warm Welcome, the resettlement scheme. Fahim Zazida runs a charity from the Afghan and Community Welfare Centre, which helps new arrivals to adjust to life in the West Midlands. He says that since the current Afghanistan crisis, there have been more calls for help.
Most people came, when I talked to them, it just came with their own clothes, nothing else. We had to respond to this crisis and support those who are arriving. So I put a call out for donation for the newly arrived families, and the response has been really positive, and we have received lots of donation, clothing, food item, household item.
But donations are one thing, living somewhere permanently is another, and that's where councils come in. Some councils say that they are worried about having to provide more accommodation for Afghan families at a time when they already have a shortage of affordable housing. And the Mayor of Bristol said very recently that they would take just 10 families unless the government provided more money. We spoke to another person from Afghanistan who arrived here recently. He worked on the front line with the British forces. He asked that we conceal his identity to protect his family from the Taliban back home.
If I stay in Afghanistan, I'm sure that they will find me and they will shoot me. The situation is too bad over there. Now there is no education like for them. They will not start like there is not a good education so there is no work for them. So and maybe in the future there will be these guys will make a problem because of me. If the UK government help us to bring them to the UK, it will be very nice and I will appreciate it.
There are 333 councils in England. Data shows that Yorkshire and Humber has taken 3,590 refugees, more than the South East, which took over the same period 2,088 refugees, while the North West has taken more than London. It took 1,109. It's not clear how many Afghan refugees each council will take, but a new London Council survey suggests 27 London boroughs have indicated a willingness and ability to take between 125 and 152 Afghan families coming into the UK. The government has said councils in England, Scotland and Wales will have access to a share of an additional £5 million to help them provide the necessary housing and support. Some of the newly arrived Afghans are in temporary housing. They tell us they feel as if their future is uncertain.
I don't know where they're going to end up next 2 weeks' time because they all are in temporary accommodation. They might be in different location. They might be here staying. We don't know yet.
Ministers are calling on all local authorities who have not yet come forward with a firm offer of support to help the Afghan people. Their exact destiny lies in the hands of the council, who will offer them a new beginning.
Seema Katecha with that report. Now, last month, the number of electric cars sold in the UK was higher than the number of diesel cars. But if people are not using fuel, they're not paying fuel duty. And it's this that raises the possibility of road pricing, long talked about, but to little end. Could that soon change? Ben Chu at the Newsnight wall explains for us, Ben.
Yes, Emily, with transport currently producing a quarter of the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions, the electric vehicle revolution is fundamental to achieving our net zero targets. We simply can't get there without it, yet it also creates a major problem for the government in the form of evaporating fuel duty receipts. Electric vehicles don't, of course, use petrol, so their drivers don't pay fuel duty. So how big is the hole? Revenues are projected to fall from £32 billion to £22 billion by the end of the decade, and to just £2 billion by 2040. That £30 billion drop is equivalent to around half of all defence spending. It's simply not a loss of revenue the government can live with. It's also hazardous in terms of drivers' incentives. Without the fuel duty tax to encourage people to reduce their car journeys, the likelihood is that congestion, which has already been rising, would explode. And at this point, it's worth pointing out that despite frequent claims the government is waging a war on motorists, the cost of travel by car has risen less than it has for other forms of transport, such as rail and buses over the past decade. The top line in this chart shows the rise in bus fares. The next highest shows rail fare increases. Then we have the cost of living in blue and then motoring costs in green along the bottom. What we see is that the cost of motoring has risen less than general inflation, meaning that in real terms, driving has got cheaper. Now, the obvious policy solution to the looming gap in revenues is some form of road pricing, where drivers pay according to how far they drive in whatever form of vehicle. We have the technology to enable us to track the movements of cars. The problem is not the tech, it's the politics. Though this would be essentially replacing an existing motoring tax rather than imposing a new one, it could be expected to face serious resistance from backbench Tory MPs and newspapers. Over the past decade, Tory chancellors have every single year failed to follow through on their stated plans to increase fuel duty out of fear of the power of this lobby. The government's transport decarbonisation plan, belatedly published in July, rather oddly made no mention of road pricing. Newsnight understands that some fairly anodyne words on this subject were removed from the document at the last moment, underlining how politically sensitive it is. Newsnight raised this issue with the Chancellor last month when he equivocated.
It just seems obvious that you're going to get it from somewhere else. Road pricing, for example.
Yeah, I mean, look, many people are speculating about what the right thing to do there is, and actually in Parliament the Select Committee is currently doing a report into this, which we'll look forward to reading what they have to say on that.
Now, taxing motoring is politically difficult, as we saw with the mass yellow vest protests in France, sparked in part by fuel prices and their impact on the cost of living for less well-off people in rural areas. But equivocation has almost reached the end of the road. Road pricing is not a subject that any longer can be ignored by a government that wants mass adoption of electric cars and a Chancellor who is determined to keep the public finances in the correct lane.
Ben, thanks very much. Well, joining us now is Robert Goodwill, Conservative MP and former Transport Minister. Robert Goodwill, do you accept that we need road pricing? Do you think it's going to come in?
Well, we did look at this in opposition, specifically for the issue of foreign trucks using our roads, because the European Commission at the time didn't want us to charge per day, which we eventually managed to do. But I think it's probably going to have to come, because we need to keep the money coming in for the infrastructure in road and rail. So I think this may be coming. And we've already got a lot of congestion charging around the country. We've got the M6 toll. So it might be one way of bringing together all these different types of disparate charges. And of course, when we looked at it 10 years ago, we thought that we'd make it voluntary for low mileage users to go into the scheme to begin with. A bit like when the water metering first went in, it was the elderly person on their own in a big house that went onto it first. So there could be ways of migrating onto the system without actually costing people more money. We've given incentive for people to opt in.
I mean, the staggering thing from Ben's piece was that graph which showed that motoring of all the forms of transport is the one that has got cheaper. It's the one that has risen less than inflation. I mean, it's staggering when you think of this phrase that has been used, rolled out over a decade, of the war on the motorist. It's simply not true, is it?
That's right. I mean, 20 years ago, around about 2.3% of national income was fuel duty. Now it's only 1.3%. We've had the freeze for a number of years now because it's very politically contentious. But, people do understand that we need to invest in roads. And when vehicle excise duty was first brought in, it was the road tax. It was a tax to pay for the roads. So I think if we're going to see these bypasses, going to see HS2, which will take pressure off the roads, get more freight off the roads onto rail and help motorists in that way, I think people, if they understand that's the deal, that they'll be paying to use their roads. And also, by the way, another advantage is we all complain about the unfairness of online shopping and, the fact that the high street is dying. Well, we could load up the charge for vans in residential areas, which would be one way of recouping some of the income that we're not getting from people like Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, do the Conservatives need to change their tune with regard to how they see the motorists? You signed a letter by your colleague Craig McKinley entitled "The Uncalled For War on the Motorist." I mean, what should the Conservative policy be now? Should it be that motoring has got to get more expensive?
Well, at the moment, your report says it's going to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, because as we migrate to electric cars, we won't be paying vehicle excise duty, we won't be paying tax on our diesel and petrol. So we do need to think of another way of fairly collecting income from motorists to invest in those. In my area, the A64 is overdue dualling in important parts. We need to do that. And I think if motorists saw they were getting that investment in return, they may well go for that particular option of charging.
Robert Goodwill, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us this evening. It has been 7 years since the civil war in Yemen started. The current front